The morning of September 12th, 1943, somewhere in the Western Pacific, aboard the battleship Musashi, Admiral Mineichi Koga stared at the intelligence report that had just been decoded. His predecessor, Isoroku Yamamoto, had been dead for 5 months, ambushed over Bougainville by American fighters that somehow knew his exact flight path. Now Koga commanded the combined fleet, and the numbers before him confirmed Yamamoto's darkest predictions: USS Essex, USS Yorktown, USS Lexington. 3 new American fleet carriers, each displacing over 27,000 tons, had joined the Pacific Fleet in just the past 4 months. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. USS Bunker Hill would commission in 2 weeks, Wasp in 3. Hornet would follow in November. The intelligence summary estimated 12 more were under construction at American shipyards. Koga had served in Washington as a naval attaché in the 1930s. He had seen the foundries of Pittsburgh, the assembly lines of Detroit, understood what Yamamoto had tried to tell the army generals before the war. But understanding and confronting the reality were different things entirely. 6 months. Yamamoto had promised he could run wild for 6 months, perhaps a year. After that, he had no confidence. It had been 9 months since Midway. The Americans weren't just recovering, they were multiplying. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand what Koga was facing that September morning, you must go back to a conversation that took place nearly 3 years earlier, in November 1940. Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe had summoned Admiral Yamamoto to a private meeting. The political situation was deteriorating. Konoe needed to know what the Navy could deliver. Said, "I shall run wild considerably for the first 6 months or a year, but I have utterly no confidence for the 2nd and 3rd years." Yamamoto had spent years in America. He had studied at Harvard, served as naval attaché in Washington from 1925 to 1927, while other Japanese officers dismissed America as soft, corrupted by wealth and comfort. Yamamoto had driven across the continent. He had seen the oil fields of Texas, the steel mills of Pennsylvania, the automobile factories of Michigan. He had watched a single Ford plant in River Rouge produce more vehicles in a month than Japan's entire automotive industry produced in a year. The numbers were overwhelming. In 1940, the United States produced 190 million barrels of oil annually. Japan produced barely 200,000 barrels and imported the rest. The United States mined 375 million tons. Japan mined 56 million. American steel production reached 60 million tons per year. Japan managed 7 million. Yamamoto understood what these disparities meant for naval warfare. Aircraft carriers weren't just ships. They were floating cities requiring thousands of tons of steel, intricate machinery, advanced electronics, and precision engineering. They needed trained crews numbering over 3,000 men. They carried aircraft that represented the cutting edge of aeronautical technology, each plane requiring aluminum, aviation fuel, and weapons. Japan could build carriers. But could Japan replace carriers at the rate America would inevitably destroy them? Pearl Harbor was a tactical masterpiece. In 90 minutes, Japanese carrier aircraft had sunk or damaged 8 American battleships, destroyed 188 aircraft, and killed over 2,000 Americans. The mobile force, Kaido, Butai, steamed away unscathed. But Yamamoto had not celebrated. While his staff officers toasted their victory with sake, Yamamoto reportedly spent December 8th sunk in apparent depression. The attack was supposed to begin 30 minutes after Japan declared war. The foreign ministry had bungled the timing. The strike came while the nations were technically at peace, transforming a military operation into what Americans would forever call a sneak attack. Yamamoto knew what American anger meant. He had seen newsreels of American factories converting from civilian to military production during the First World War. He knew the sleeping giant was now awake and furious. The first 6 months went exactly as Yamamoto predicted. Japanese forces swept across the Pacific and Southeast Asia like a tidal wave. Wake Island fell. Guam surrendered. Hong Kong collapsed. Singapore, Britain's impregnable fortress, capitulated after a campaign that humiliated the Western powers. The Philippines held out until May, but the outcome was never in doubt. The mobile force roamed at will. In April 1942, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo led 5 carriers into the Indian Ocean. British Admiral Sir James Somerville's Eastern Fleet fled to avoid destruction. Japanese carrier aircraft sank the British heavy cruisers Cornwall and Dorsetshire, then caught the carrier Hermes without air cover and sent it to the bottom. The British abandoned Ceylon and withdrew to East Africa. For 6 months, Japan was invincible. Then came the Coral Sea in May 1942. The Japanese light carrier Shoho was sunk. The fleet carrier Shokaku took 3 bomb hits and limped back to Japan for months of repairs. The carrier Zuikaku survived undamaged, but lost so many aircraft and pilots that she was combat ineffective for months. The Americans lost the carrier Lexington and the Yorktown was damaged. Something crucial. American carrier pilots could fight. 4 weeks later, at Midway, Yamamoto's 6-month timeline expired with catastrophic precision. June 4th through 7th, 1942. Yamamoto had assembled the most powerful naval force Japan had ever sent to sea. 11 battleships, 8 carriers, 23 cruisers, 65 destroyers, over 250 ships total, carrying the cream of Japanese naval aviation. The plan was intricate, involving multiple task forces approaching from different directions to confuse and overwhelm the Americans. The mobile force under Nagumo would strike Midway Island, while Yamamoto's main body with the battleship Yamato waited to the west. Once American carriers responded, Japanese submarines and surface ships would destroy them in a decisive engagement, but American cryptographers had broken Japanese naval codes. Admiral Chester Nimitz knew the attack was coming. He knew when. He knew where. Carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown positioned themselves northeast of Midway and waited. When it ended, 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were on the bottom of the Pacific. With them went over 300 aircraft, and, more critically, over 100 of Japan's most experienced carrier pilots. These were men who had trained for years, who had perfected their skills at Pearl Harbor, in the Dutch East Indies, in the Indian Ocean. It was a fair exchange tactorially, 1 carrier for 4, but strategically it was devastating. Japan began the war with 10 fleet and light carriers. By August 1942, 4 were sunk. Shokaku and Zuikaku were being repaired or reconstituted. That left 4 operational carriers to face the American counteroffensive that would inevitably come. The United States had begun the war with 7 carriers in the Pacific. By October 1942, after the battles of Coral Sea, Midway, and the Eastern Solomons, they were down to 1 operational carrier in the entire Pacific theater, the battered Enterprise. For 2 weeks in late October, after the carrier Hornet was sunk at Santa Cruz, Enterprise was the only American fleet carrier operational in the Pacific. 2 nations, each reduced to a handful of carriers, both bleeding, both building. The question was which could build faster. The answer was already taking shape in American shipyards. In April 1941, 5 months before Pearl Harbor, Newport News Shipbuilding and Drydock Company in Virginia had laid the keel of a new carrier designated CV-9. The design was called the Essex class, and it represented everything American naval architects had learned from the Yorktown and Wasp classes, freed from the tonnage restrictions of the Washington Naval Treaty. The treaty had expired in 1936. For the first time since 1922, American naval designers could build without artificial limits. The only restriction was the width of the Panama Canal locks, which determined the maximum beam. The Essex class displaced 27,100 tons at standard load. The hull measured 872 feet long and had a beam of 93 feet. The armored flight deck stretched 862 feet. 4 steam turbines generated 150,000 shaft horsepower, driving the ship at 33 knots. The fuel capacity of 6,500 tons gave a range of 20,000 miles at 15 knots. But the real power was the air group. 36 fighters, 36 dive bombers, 18 torpedo bombers. This was 50% more aircraft than the Yorktown class could carry. The hangar deck was subdivided by rolling steel doors, allowing damage control, teams to isolate fires. Multiple aviation fuel systems reduced vulnerability. The Combat Information Center, a revolutionary concept, was located below the armored deck where it could coordinate the ship's defense. The anti-aircraft armament was formidable: 12 5-inch, 38 caliber dual-purpose guns in twin mounts. The newer long-hull variants would carry up to 72 40mm Bofors guns and 60 20mm Oerlikon cannons. With proximity-fused shells, the 5-inch battery could shred incoming aircraft at ranges over 5 miles. Most importantly, the design was standardized. Every Essex-class carrier built in different shipyards used identical components. This allowed mass production techniques rarely applied to capital warships. Construction of CV-9, named Essex, proceeded through 1941 and into 1942. The attack on Pearl Harbor accelerated everything. Welders worked around the clock. Steel plate arrived from mills that had converted from producing automobiles to producing armor. The launch date was moved up, the commissioning schedule compressed. On July 31, 1942, Essex slid down the ways at Newport News. 4 months later, on December 31, 1942, exactly 1 year after construction began, Captain Donald Duncan commissioned USS Essex into the United States Navy. The original construction schedule had called for 42 months, from keel laying to commissioning. But Essex was just the beginning. On June 19, 1942, while the Battle of Midway raged, Brooklyn Navy Yard laid the keel of CV-10. She would be named Yorktown after the carrier sunk at Midway. Construction proceeded even faster than Essex. On January 15, 1943, just 19 months after her keel was laid, USS Yorktown commissioned. 3 days. Earlier, on January 12th, Philadelphia Navy Yard had commissioned USS Intrepid, CV-11. She had been under construction for 20 months. On April 24, 1943, USS Lexington, CV-16, commissioned at Quincy, Massachusetts. She bore the name of the carrier lost at Coral Sea. Construction time, 18 months. May 31st, USS Bunker Hill, CV-17. 17 months. July 1st, USS Wasp, CV-18. 19 months. November 29th, USS Hornet, CV-12. 17 months. The numbers themselves told a story. What had taken American shipyards 3 to 4 years to build before the war now took between 14 and 20 months. The fastest was USS Franklin, CV-13, commissioned at Newport News in just 14 months. 24 Essex-class carriers would eventually be completed. 18 would commission during the war, and they represented only part of American carrier construction, while the Essex-class was being built. 9 Cleveland-class light cruiser hulls were converted into Independence-class light carriers. These ships displaced 11,000 tons, carried 30 aircraft, and could operate with the Essex carriers in the fast carrier task forces. All 9 commissioned between January and December 1943. Beyond these fleet and light carriers, American shipyards were producing escort carriers at rates that defied comprehension. These smaller ships, built on merchant hulls, carried 20 to 30 aircraft and were designed for convoy escort, submarine hunting, and amphibious support. Henry Kaiser's shipyards would produce 50 Casablanca-class escort carriers in 1 year. Japanese naval intelligence tracked this construction with growing alarm. Their pre-war estimates of American industrial capacity had been reasonably accurate. They had correctly predicted how many carriers, battleships, and cruisers American yards could produce through 1945. Building a carrier was one thing. Building carriers while simultaneously expanding shipyard capacity, training tens of thousands of new workers, coordinating supply chains across an entire continent, and maintaining quality control required industrial management on a scale Japan had never attempted. More critically, Japanese intelligence had completely underestimated American personnel mobilization. They had predicted that by December 1943, the United States Navy would have approximately 13,000 officers and 296,000 enlisted men. The actual numbers were 219,000 officers, 120,000 officer candidates, and over 2 million enlisted men. The Japanese estimate was off by a factor of 7. Where were all these men coming from? And more importantly, how was the American Navy training them so quickly? The answer lay in programs that Japan's rigid military culture could never replicate. The United States had established the V-5 program in 1939, allowing civilian college students to receive flight training while completing their degrees. By 1943, this had expanded into a massive pilot training infrastructure, producing over 20,000 naval aviators per year. New carriers needed crews of 3,000 men. American training facilities were processing them in assembly line fashion. Boot camps expanded from a few thousand to hundreds of thousands of recruits. Specialized schools taught radar operation, damage control, engineering, aviation mechanics. Men who had never seen the ocean 6 months earlier were now manning combat stations on carriers heading into battle, and the carriers kept coming. In May 1943, USS Essex arrived at Pearl Harbor. The ship that would give its name to the most numerous class of capital ships ever built was finally ready for combat. Rear Admiral Charles Pownall raised his flag aboard her, and on August 31st, Essex and Yorktown launched the first major carrier strike by the new class against Marcus Island. It was a statement operation. 2 brand new fleet carriers, operating together, demonstrating capabilities that would have been impossible a year earlier. The raid destroyed most of Marcus Island's installations and demonstrated that American carriers could now strike where they pleased. The Americans weren't just rebuilding from Midway. They were transforming naval warfare itself. In October 1943, Essex, Yorktown, and Lexington struck Wake Island. In November, they hit Rabaul, Japan's major base in the South Pacific, coordinating with land-based aircraft in a devastating attack that forced the Japanese combined fleet to abandon Rabaul as an advanced base. The Gilbert's operation in November brought Essex-class carriers into their first amphibious assault. Essex, Bunker Hill, and Yorktown, operating with the light carriers Independence and Princeton, provided air cover for the invasion of Tarawa and Macon. Japanese aircraft attempting to interfere were massacred by combat air patrols of new Saisef Hellcat fighters operating from the carriers. The Hellcat exemplified American technological advancement. Designed specifically to counter the Zero, it was faster, more durable, and more heavily armed than Japan's premier fighter. More importantly, it was produced in staggering numbers. Grumman's factories would build over 12,000 Hellcats during the war. The ratio of Hellcats to Zeros in combat would eventually reach 19-1 in favor of the Hellcat. By the end of 1943, 7 Essex-class carriers were operational in the Pacific. 7 more were under construction or fitting out. The fast carrier task force that had been a concept at the beginning of the year was now a reality. Task Force 58, as it was designated under Admiral Raymond Spruance, represented concentrated naval air power unprecedented in history. By early 1944, it would include 12 fleet carriers, 8 light carriers, 6 fast battleships, 13 cruisers, and 58 destroyers. The carriers alone could launch over 900 aircraft in a single strike. Admiral Koga understood what this meant. Japan had entered the war with 10 carriers. America would finish 1943 with more operational carriers than Japan had possessed at its peak. And the Americans were just getting started. The industrial disparity was even worse than Yamamoto had feared. American shipyards weren't just building carriers faster, they were building everything faster. Destroyers that once took 18 months to complete were now launching after 9 months. Liberty cargo ships were being produced at a rate of 3 per day. Japanese shipyards, meanwhile, struggled with resource shortages. Steel allocations went to the army. Aluminum was diverted to aircraft production. Skilled workers were conscripted into the military. American submarines were sinking the tankers, bringing oil from the Dutch East Indies, forcing carriers to remain in port. Japan had started the war with 16 fleet carriers planned or under construction. By late 1943, 3 had been completed. Unyo and Hyo both converted from ocean liner hulls before the war began, and Taiho, Japan's first armored deck carrier. The Unryu-class carriers, Japan's answer to the Essex class, were under construction, but the first wouldn't commission until August 1944. Only 3 Unryu-class carriers would be completed during the war. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The mathematics were crushing. In the same time it took Japan to complete 3 carriers, America had completed 18, plus 9 light carriers, plus dozens of escort carriers. Koga knew what was coming. The Americans would assemble their fast carrier task force and strike into the Central Pacific. They would seize island after island, building airfields as they advanced, bringing their bombers closer to Japan itself. The mobile force, which had once ruled from Hawaii to Ceylon, was now reduced to defending an ever-contracting perimeter. On February 17th and 18th, 1944, the Americans struck Truk, Japan's major forward base in the Caroline Islands. Task Force 58 appeared without warning, launching massive strikes that destroyed over 270 aircraft and sank over 40 ships. The attack was devastating, but what terrified Japanese commanders was the composition of the American force: 9 Essex-class carriers, 4 light carriers, supporting battleships and cruisers, nearly 1,000 aircraft. A year earlier, this force would have been impossible. Now it was routine. The raid on Truk forced Admiral Koga to relocate the combined fleet to Palau, further from the action. The defensive perimeter was collapsing. The Americans seized the Marshall Islands in February. They would take the Marianas in June. From the Marianas, B-29 super fortresses could reach Japan itself. Koga never lived to see the Marianas fall. On March 31st, 1944, his aircraft flew into a typhoon while en route to the Philippines. The plane disappeared. Admiral Koga's body was never found. His replacement, Admiral Soemu Toyoda, inherited a strategic situation that had become hopeless. The mathematics that Yamamoto had understood 3 years earlier were now undeniable reality. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Battle of the Philippine, see in June 1944, demonstrated just how far the balance had shifted. The Japanese launched Operation A-Go, attempting to use land-based aircraft from the Marianas, combined with a 9-carrier mobile fleet, to destroy the American invasion force. Admiral Jisaburo Osawa commanded the Japanese carriers. He had the new armored deck carrier Taiho, commissioned just 3 months earlier. He had 5 light carriers, Junyo, Hyo, Ryuho, Chitose, and Chiyoda. His carriers could launch 450 aircraft. Facing him was Task Force 58 under Admiral Mark Mitcher, 7 Essex-class carriers, Hornet, Yorktown, Bunker Hill, Wasp, Essex, Lexington, and Enterprise, the only pre-war carrier still operational, 8 light carriers, over 900 aircraft. Supporting the carriers were 7 fast battleships, including the new Iowa and New Jersey, 13 cruisers, and 69 destroyers. The battle was not close. On June 19, 1944, Osawa launched 4 major strikes against the American fleet. Japanese aircraft flew into a defensive screen more formidable than anything they had encountered before. Task Force 58, had revolutionized carrier defense. Multiple radar-equipped picket destroyers gave early warning. Combat air patrols of Hellcats, stacked at different altitudes, were directed by fighter direction officers using radar data processed in the combat information centers. The result was slaughter. American pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Over 300 Japanese aircraft were shot down. Fewer than 30 American planes were lost. Not a single American ship was even seriously damaged. While the air battle raged, American submarines stalked Ozawa's carriers. USS Albacore put 3 torpedoes into Taiho. The new carrier's aviation fuel system wasn't properly ventilated. Gasoline vapors filled the lower decks. Hours later, Taiho exploded and sank. USS Kawaya torpedoed Shokaku. Hit by 3 torpedoes, racked by internal explosions, the veteran carrier of Pearl Harbor and Coral Sea capsized and sank. 2 carriers lost in one day, along with over 300 aircraft. The next day, June 20th, American carrier aircraft found the retreating Japanese fleet and launched a desperate long-range strike at maximum range. They sank the carrier Hio, destroyed 65 more Japanese aircraft, and damaged several other ships. The mobile fleet limped back to Japan, having lost 3 carriers, over 450 aircraft, and most critically, over 450 pilots. Japan had started the war with approximately 3,500 trained carrier pilots. 1942 had never materialized. Fuel shortages limited training flights. Experienced instructors were kept in combat units instead of training new pilots. The replacements arriving at carriers in 1944 had perhaps 100 hours of flight time. Admiral Toyoda looked at the casualty reports from the Philippine Sea and understood that Japan no longer possessed a carrier force capable of fleet operations. Suikaku, the last survivor of the Pearl Harbor attack, had aircraft but barely enough pilots to fly them. The light carriers were similarly depleted. New carriers under construction would have no trained air groups to operate from them. 4 months later, in October 1944, the desperation became absolute. The Americans invaded the Philippines. Japan's oil lifeline from the Dutch East Indies was threatened. Without oil, the combined fleet would be immobilized. Without the Philippines, Japan would be cut off from its resource base in Southeast Asia. The war would be over. Toyoda ordered Operation Shogo, the last major naval offensive of the war. Every available warship would converge on Leyte Gulf, where American forces were landing. The plan was intricate, involving multiple forces approaching from different directions. It was also suicidal. Admiral Osawa commanded what remained of Japan's carrier force. 4 carriers, Suikaku, Suiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda. Between them, they carried 108 aircraft, most flown by barely trained pilots. But the carriers weren't intended to fight. They were decoys. Osawa's mission was to steam south from Japan, allowing himself to be spotted by American reconnaissance, then draw away the American fast carrier task force. While the American carriers chased Osawa's decoys, 2 powerful surface forces would penetrate Leyte Gulf from the west and south, destroying the American invasion fleet with gunfire. The plan almost worked. On October 24th, American carrier aircraft found Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force approaching through the Sibuyan Sea. The super battleship Musashi, largest battleship ever built, took 17 bomb hits and 19 torpedo hits before capsizing. But Kurita pressed on. That night, the Southern force attempted to force the Surigao Strait and was annihilated by American battleships and cruisers in the last battleship versus battleship engagement in history. But Kurita's center force transited San Bernardino Strait unopposed and emerged off Sama on the morning of October 25th. Facing Kurita was Taffy 3, a group of 6 escort carriers screened by destroyers. These were not the Essex-class fleet carriers. These were 11,000-ton converted merchant ships with thin hulls and light armament. Their aircraft were configured for ground support, not naval combat. They had no armor-piercing bombs, no aerial torpedoes. Kurita had 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Against Taffy 3's escort carriers, it should have been a massacre. The Americans fought with desperate courage. Destroyers charged the Japanese battle line, launching torpedoes and firing guns against ships 10 times their size. The escort carriers launched every aircraft they had, making dry runs after their ordnance was exhausted, dropping depth charges on cruisers, strafing battleship bridges. Kurita's force sank the escort carrier Gambia Bay and 3 destroyers, but the ferocious resistance convinced him he was facing fleet carriers with massive reinforcements approaching. He withdrew. Meanwhile, far to the north, Admiral William Halsey had taken the bait. Task Force 38, with 6 Essex-class fleet carriers and 5 light carriers, had steamed north chasing Osawa's decoy force. On October 25th, Halsey's carriers launched strike after strike against Osawa's ships. All 4 Japanese carriers were sunk. Suikaku, the last Pearl Harbor veteran, capsized after taking multiple torpedo and bomb hits. The light carriers, Suiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda went down with her. Over 100 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. It was the end of Japanese carrier aviation as a fighting force, but the victory was hollow. While Halsey had been sinking empty carriers in the north, Kurita had nearly destroyed the invasion fleet at Samar. Only the sacrifice of Taffy 3 had prevented disaster. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was an American victory, but it revealed the danger of overreaching. For Japan, Leyte Gulf was the end. 4 carriers sunk, 3 battleships including Musashi, 10 cruisers, 9 destroyers. The mobile fleet ceased to exist as an operational force. Japan had started the war with 63 destroyers. By the end of Leyte Gulf, 47 were sunk. The combined fleet would never sortie in. Strength again. The numbers Admiral Koga had stared at in September 1943 had proven conservative. By November 1944, the United States had commissioned 14 Essex-class carriers, 9 Independence-class light carriers, and over 70 escort carriers. Task Force 38 routinely operated with more carriers than Japan had possessed at the start of the war. And the Americans were still building. USS Bonhomme Richard, commissioned in November 1944. USS Boxer in April 1945. USS Lake Champlain in June. USS Antietam in September, after the war ended. 4 more would commission in 1946 and 1947. 24 Essex-class carriers total. The 20th century's most numerous class of capital ship. 17 would see combat during World War II. 10 would be damaged by kamikaze attacks or other action. None would be sunk. The defensive power of an Essex-class carrier proved as impressive as its offensive capability. On November 25, 1944, a kamikaze struck USS Essex off the Philippines, hitting the port edge of the flight deck among foiled aircraft. The resulting fire killed 15 men and wounded 44, but the ship remained operational. On March 19, 1945, off Okinawa, USS Franklin suffered one of the most devastating attacks of the war. A single Japanese bomber penetrated the combat air patrol and dropped 2 500-pound bombs on Franklin's flight deck. The bombs exploded among fully foiled and armed aircraft preparing for launch. The resulting explosions killed over 800 men and wounded over 400 more. Fires raged through the hangar deck. Ammunition exploded. The ship listed 14 degrees and lost all power. Captain Leslie Gerris refused orders to abandon ship. Damage control parties fought the fires for hours. The cruiser Pittsburgh took Franklin under tow. Somehow, incredibly, Franklin survived. She made port under her own power and was eventually repaired, though she never returned to combat. But she survived, a testament to the Essex class's damage resistance. By contrast, Japanese carriers rarely survived even moderate damage. Poor damage control training, inadequate firefighting equipment, and volatile aviation fuel systems meant that hits often resulted in catastrophic losses. At Midway, 3 Japanese carriers were sunk by relatively light bomb damage that sparked uncontrollable fires. At Philippine Sea, Taiho, the newest and most advanced Japanese carrier, sank from gasoline vapor explosions after taking just 3 torpedo hits. The disparity went beyond ships. American logistics revolutionized naval warfare. The service squadron system allowed fleet oilers, ammunition ships, and provisions vessels to meet the fast carrier task force at sea. Task Force 38 could remain at sea for months, refueling and rearming without returning to port. Japanese carriers had to return to base for replenishment, limiting their operational radius and flexibility. American naval aviation doctrine evolved with stunning speed. In 1942, American carrier air groups consisted of equal numbers of fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers. By 1944, fighters comprised 65% of the air group. The Americans had realized that controlling the air was paramount. Fighters could be equipped with bombs for strike missions after achieving air superiority, while dive bombers and torpedo planes were vulnerable to enemy fighters. Japan's doctrine remained largely static. Air groups still consisted primarily of attack aircraft, with fighters composing only 34% of the total. This made Japanese carriers vulnerable to American fighter sweeps that could destroy attack aircraft before they launched. Technology compounded the disparity. American radar gave early warning of incoming attacks and allowed precise fighter direction. Japanese radar lagged years behind. American proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells exploded near targets, dramatically increasing lethality. Japan never developed comparable technology. American damage control was systematic and well-trained. Japanese damage control was improvised and often ineffective. But the fundamental difference was industrial capacity. When USS Franklin was hit off Okinawa, she could be replaced. America had 13 other Essex-class carriers operational, with more completing. When Japan lost Taiho at Philippine Sea, there was no replacement. The shipyards were building carriers that would have no air groups to operate from them. In February 1945, Task Force 58 struck Tokyo itself. 16 fleet carriers launched over 1,000 aircraft against the Japanese home islands. Demonstration of complete aerial dominance. The Americans could strike anywhere, at any time, with overwhelming force. The Okinawa campaign in April and May 1945 saw the fast carrier task force reach its apotheosis. At its peak, Task Force 58 included 11 Essex-class carriers, 6 light carriers, 8 fast battleships, and over 60 destroyers. Over 1,100 aircraft operated from the carriers. Japanese resistance consisted primarily of kamikaze attacks. American Hellcats and Corsairs massacred any Japanese formation attempting orthodox tactics. Hundreds of suicide aircraft attacked the fleet off Okinawa between April and June. Several carriers were hit, including Bunker Hill, which suffered devastating damage from 2 kamikazes on May 11th, killing over 390 men. But even heavily damaged carriers survived. By August 1945, when Japan surrendered, the United States Navy possessed 15 Essex-class carriers in commission, with 3 more completing. The Imperial Japanese Navy had 4 carriers remaining, all damaged or inoperable, with no fuel and no trained pilots. The mathematics Yamamoto had understood in November 1940 had come to fruition exactly as he predicted. Japan had run wild for 6 months. Then, American industrial capacity had overwhelmed everything. The production statistics tell the story with brutal clarity. During the war, American shipyards produced 24 Essex-class fleet carriers, 9 Independence-class light carriers, over 70 escort carriers, 8 fast battleships, 48 cruisers, 352, destroyers, 203, submarines. Japanese shipyards produced 3 fleet carriers completed after December 1941, 5 light carriers, 2 battleships, 9 cruisers, 63 destroyers, 126 submarines. In fleet carriers, the disparity was 8-1. In total carriers of all types, it was 34-1. In every category of major warship, American production exceeded Japanese production by factors of 3 to 10. The aircraft disparity was even more lopsided. American factories produced over 300,000 military aircraft during the war. Japanese factories produced 76,000, 4 to 1. But the American total included massive numbers of 4-engine heavy bombers, twin-engine medium bombers, and transport aircraft. In terms of total weight of aircraft produced, total number of engines, and total combat payload capability, the ratio was closer to 8 to 1. Admiral Yamamoto had known. He had tried to warn the army generals, the cabinet, the emperor himself. A war with America would be decided not by courage or skill or fighting spirit, but by mathematics, by steel production and oil reserves and industrial capacity. The Americans had demonstrated exactly what Yamamoto feared. They could absorb catastrophic losses, like the carriers sunk in 1942, and not just recover, but multiply their strength. They could build carriers faster than Japan could sink them. They could train pilots faster than Japan could kill them. They could replace losses and expand simultaneously. Japan had started the war hoping to seize resource-rich territories in Southeast Asia, then negotiate a favorable peace from a position of strength. The assumption was that America, soft and democracy weakened, would not have the will to fight a protracted war across the Pacific. Yamamoto had known better. He had seen American oil fields and steel mills and factories. He knew Americans would not negotiate after Pearl Harbor. The surprise attack had guaranteed that America would fight until Japan was destroyed. And now, in August 1945, Japan faced exactly that destruction. Had obliterated Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Soviet Union had declared war and invaded Manchuria. The home islands were under blockade. American carriers operated off the coast with impunity. B-29 bombers had burned over 60 Japanese cities to ashes. On September 2, 1945, aboard the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu signed the Instrument of Surrender. Standing witness were hundreds of American officers from the carrier fleet that had made this moment inevitable. High overhead, 400 carrier aircraft from Task Force 38 flew in formation. Hellcats and Corsairs and Helldivers from the Essex-class carriers that had driven across the Pacific. The display was not triumphalism. It was simply statement of fact. This was the force that had defeated Japan. Among those aircraft were planes from USS Essex, the carrier that had started it all. She had survived the entire war, earned 13 battle stars, and participated in nearly every major operation from 1943 onward. She would serve for another 26 years, finally decommissioning in 1969. USS Lexington, commissioned in 1943, would serve until 1991, 48 years in service, operating as a training carrier for her final 2 decades. When she finally decommissioned, she was the oldest working carrier in the world. These ships, built in months rather than years, standardized rather than custom-designed, represented American industrial capacity at its peak. They were not the most elegant carriers ever built. British and Japanese carriers had better armor protection. Later American supercarriers would be far more capable. But the Essex class was producible, maintainable, and effective. They could be built in numbers that overwhelmed opponents. The legacy of the Essex class extends beyond their wartime service. 15 of the 24 ships underwent extensive modernization in the 1950s, receiving angled flight decks, steam catapults, and strengthened structures to operate jet aircraft. They served through the Cold War, fought in Korea and Vietnam, recovered astronauts from space missions, and projected American power globally for 5 decades. 4 Essex-class carriers survive as museum ships today. USS Yorktown in Charleston, South Carolina. USS Lexington in Corpus Christi, Texas. They stand as monuments to American industrial mobilization and the shipyard workers who built them, but they also stand as monuments to Yamamoto's prophecy. 6 months. That was all Japan had. After that, mathematics took over. The admiral who planned Pearl Harbor understood better than anyone that success in those first 6 months would only delay the inevitable. American industrial capacity, once mobilized, would produce forces that Japan could never match. Bithio asks about a Japanese admiral who had 6 hours to stop American carriers being built one every 15 days. And it wasn't one carrier every 15 days, it was one carrier every 2 months in 1943 and 44, along with light carriers and escort carriers at even faster rates. Admiral Yamamoto had that 6-month window to force a negotiated peace before American production overwhelmed Japan. He tried. Pearl Harbor, the Indian Ocean raid, the operations in Southeast Asia, all were designed to shatter American will quickly. The Essex-class carriers began arriving. Task Force 58 formed. The mathematics of industrial capacity played out exactly as Yamamoto feared. He never saw the Essex-class carriers in action. He died in April 1943, his plane ambushed over Bougainville, when American codebreakers read Japanese communications and fighter pilots executed him. By the time he died, 3 Essex-class carriers were operational, or nearly so. By the time the war ended, 18 had fought in the Pacific, and the United States Navy was larger than all other navies in the world combined. The admiral who warned that he could run wild for 6 months had been exactly, tragically, correct. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.